I study at King's College London doing a PhD, and they funded me to come to this conference, and I'm funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. So I'm going to take you through and explain a bit about what the social housing sector is, talk about transition pathways, and then tell you about a way I think of filling that gap, especially for empirical methods, using a sort of theoretical and empirical application called institutional logics. And then hopefully this time tell you a bit about some of the initial findings about adaptive capacity in England's social housing sector. For those of you that aren't familiar with England's housing stock, this was back in 2011, which was when we had the last big national statistics, 22.3 million existing homes. I think we've now got up to 26 million. And quite a large chunk were built pre-1945, and of those, a lot built pre-1919. And the reason I've put that less than 3 million new homes have been built since 1990 is it's since 1990 that actually building standards have come into place that would help us in terms of resilience to climate change. So we actually have a really, really big problem on our hands, not only because we have a lot of existing homes to tackle, but they're all different housing typologies, so there are no standard solutions. And they were definitely not designed for future climate change projections in mind. Of those 22.3 million existing homes, 5 million are in our social housing sector. To be really brief about what our social housing sector is, it's state-funded housing for those that are deemed in housing need. And that's not just those that are economically in need, but also some of our most socially vulnerable populations, including the elderly, people that have come out of prison and being rehabilitated, the homeless, and many other people with specialist needs, and they're some of the most physiologically vulnerable. And then our future climate change predictions, just because you probably all know your own countries, but you might not know ours, we're supposedly going to get a lot more hotter weather, in fact an increasing amount of heat waves. We're going to get less cold weather, but it'll be more intense. There'll be no overall decrease in rainfall, but we'll have less events, and then they'll be heavier, which comes into play in terms of actually replenishing our water supply. So drought-affected areas are due to increase, not just because of the weather getting warmer, but also problems with replenishing our water, more intense tropical cyclone activity, and of course higher level sea rise events. So our government, we do have a good, comparatively to some other countries, a really good sort of governance approach to this. We have had a climate change risk assessment conducted in every single sector in the UK by our government, and these were the findings for the built environment industry. And what that means actually for homes, when you're talking about people in their homes, is that their home's going to be more, depending on the area they're in, more prone to subsidence, flooding, water shortages, overheating, and then of course where you're in the urban areas such as London, and actually a lot of the UK has high urban areas, you've also got the urban heat island effect. And just to give you an idea, in London that's thought to be about a 10 degrees Celsius increase in temperature on some occasions when there's heat waves. So when you're thinking about the industry change, is there the knowledge of how to mitigate for these risks? Well, we've got fantastic weather data out there. We've got these things called UK CP09 climate change projections, so we're really lucky. We've got a lot of data out there to help model for it. We've also had, very much based on the niche scaling up approach by our government, we've had projects funded where they've sort of tried to get the supply chains in action, and this is an example of technology strategy boards. They funded 50 building projects to get them to model to the climate change projections and get that incorporated within the design. But it doesn't actually result in scalar industry change. These were the report with the learning of it, but it's known by very few in the industry, and actually it's the people already bought into the process. It's not knowledge that has gone out to the rest of the industry, or indeed that the industry is actually interested in at the moment. So one of the reasons I'm sort of looking at this PhD and this research is how can we actually scale up the change when you don't necessarily have the governance behind it. And the other thing I should have pointed out is that we do have a national adaptation programme following from government, which will supposedly have a plan of action of how we're going to address those risks. But they've already said that it's going to come with no money and no policy changes and no regulatory changes. So really it's a document for those that want to actually be proactive, not something that will actually make industry change. And then there's a question of when should such measures be implemented. Well, I showed you the extent of the housing stock. It's not something that can be done overnight because you need to have very bespoke solutions per home. So we need to be starting to build it into maintenance and refurbishment plans now, and we're not. I just wanted to pick up what Jenny said earlier today, because she said we need to get tenacious about moving blockages. I'll give you an example on this climate change side of things. Overheating is one of the risks we face. In the UK, we've had a recent rash of 2 years, a lot of evidence of overheating in homes, and actually worryingly, particularly new homes. And one of the reasons is that we have a building regulation called Standard Assessment Procedure, SAP. When it is used, it doesn't actually prevent overheating, and new homes that meet regulation are already overheating, never mind if we look at our changing climate and the fact it's due to increase in heat. Yet we've been told with this national adaptation programme that there will be no regulatory change. So we can get tenacious about moving blockages, but to what extent are we going to be able to in terms of regulatory ones, and are there other ways to look at changing industry rather than being regulatory led? So that's why I'm looking at the transition pathways. And one of the questions I would ask, because a lot of the transition literature often focus on sort of public sector governance-led change, is what happens when that can't happen, or does that mean that change can't happen if we're not looking at public sector governance-led change? And the other thing I'm sort of questioning, and the reason I think transition pathways and our knowledge of what enables them at the moment is quite weak, is that there's often an assumption that champions will lead the way, that it's people that will lead the way. And I'd question, and I'll come to it, about is it actually necessarily just the individuals themselves, or the institutional framework and culture within which they're operating that enables them to actually lead that change? And if that's the case, can we actually enable more people to change? And I think ultimately I've put there, will it come down to a question of culpability? When I come to that sort of example I gave you of there's a regulation that actually causes overheating if you abide by it, will it come down to individual homeowners suing the government or suing professionals and indemnity insurance going up to actually push this change to happen? And it might. So for those of you that have never maybe tackled a development project in your life, the reason I've put this on is partly to show you the process, but also just to give you an idea of the numbers of professionals and different sectors involved in doing anything with homes, whether it's building a new home or making an extension or refurbishing a home, in the UK anyway, at least. So that's just to give you an idea of that. So I better speed up. Basically, this is to say that there has been a lot of work in the public sector looking at how to get the innovation through, but in terms of when we look at actually scaling up, that hasn't actually been bottomed up. So I will have to speed through this, but Frank did a great job earlier of explaining transitions. And what I want to get to is how we could actually use institutional logics to empirically help us, because I think one of the gaps that we have within the transitions community is actually looking at different case studies that are happening now, looking at change now, because you can look at historical trajectories, but actually we've got a lot of cultural and policy and economic change at the moment, which means what's going on in our professional industries is different. This is basically what I wanted to get to. I've merged a theory called institutional logics, which is born out of, and there was a book published last year on it. It's basically neo-institutionalist theory, sort of, they've drawn a line under it and said, actually, we've got so much change going on here, let's bring it together and have a new framework. Where I think it helps with transitions is, I think there's a big gap in that transitions pathway about how do you actually enable that change? If you identify what change you need, how do you get industry to change? How do you get those competences that Gerald was talking about earlier? People don't just change their processes by magic. They need not just leadership, but they actually need maybe the infrastructures with which they're working, the computer systems, everything else, to change as well, so that it potentially doesn't have to be an active choice to change as a professional, but is the obvious choice to change. And so that's where I find that the institutional logics is useful. It doesn't take away scale. I've taken this off the diagram. What it does is it says that the interactions between the scales are important within each field, and that you have people that are making sense-making, making decisions based on their perceptions and belief systems that are built up from what they know. And that when they make a decision, they'll either decide that it's actually a problem if there's something new and then reinforce the existing regime, or if it makes enough sense to them, and actually maybe some of these have started changing to make that decision make sense to them, then they will actually start doing it. You get legitimacy, and then you actually get the changes you need to get towards a new regime. I think I'm nearly out of time, so I just very quickly just go through this. I just wanted to point out that this is reinforced when you look at networks of influence, and you would think that for professional development you would maybe go to the professional bodies and get them to change their CPD and there would be a nice systemic change. But actually, are people actually doing continuous professional development? Are they actually having regular training? Where are they getting that information from? Is it from Google? Is it from their friends? There are a lot of assumptions about how knowledge is transferred, and if we don't go back and look at exactly what people are doing in specific sectors, trying to get this change to happen might actually prove very difficult. So I'm just going to the end now. One of the ways that change happens and that champions are able to lead change is because shadow systems are able to operate within some organisations. And one of the things I think we need to look at is what is the adaptive capacity of different organisations within a sector to change, and how can we help those organisations create a culture in which change can be enabled.